First of all, I'd just like to let everyone know that my new book, Beyond Nitro, Untold Stories from the WCW Era, is available now at guyevansbooks.com or Amazon, and that will work regardless of what country you are situated in. You can get the book, once again, from guyevansbooks.com or any variation of the Amazon website. And I'm very excited about this project. This is something that's been a long time in the making. In fact, the first interview for Beyond Nitro was conducted in May of 2020. So, of course, there have been a lot of other things that have happened in between, but it's been a long time coming, as I said, putting together this book. And it's a very unique book. It's a different structure than the Nitro book, which originally was published, of course, in 2018. That book was a chronological telling of the entire WCW story. And in order for this book to be different, I've opted for a very unique approach with Beyond Nitro, where the book is split into 3 parts. And the chapters, for the most part, are self-contained. They're standalone chapters, sort of short stories in some cases, other cases more medium or long-range stories. But they're categorized into one of 3 parts. So the first part relates really to the subtitle of the book. The first part is called Untold Stories, where I'm presenting these really detailed profiles of various people who either worked for WCW directly back in the day or had some kind of tangential relationship to the company, which is important, and that will become apparent the more that you read the chapter. So that's part 1, Untold Stories. Then part 2 is called Where the Big Boys Played. And this is where I go into, I think, some underappreciated aspects of the WCW story, which often escape introspection, such as a lot of the initiatives that were developed by its production team, the fact that WCW had this really strong Southern lineage and history, which I'm not sure has really been replicated by a mainstream wrestling promotion since. And also, and I think this is the aspect of the book which is really causing the most discussion and the most interest, over the course of 2 chapters, I go into the nature of the TBS accounting system and specifically how that related to WCW, essentially on a line item by line item basis, walking you through here's exactly how much money WCW was credited as making, not only as an overall business, but in relation to, its licensing efforts and its pay-per-view business and, its the revenues it was gaining from ticket sales and so on. We literally go through line item by line item, essentially, all of the key revenue drivers for the company, all of the expenses that were credited to WCW's books, and we investigate some of the often discussed issues with WCW's financial performance. How profitable exactly was it credited for being back in its heyday? And equally, how was it that in the year 2000, for example, it posted a $62.5 million loss? All of that is explored in 2 chapters, specifically chapters 12 and chapters 13, which kind of do go together. As I mentioned, the large majority of the chapters are self-contained, but there's a couple of 2-part chapters that have an interlude in between. There's also, as I just talked about, the 2 financial heavy chapters which link together, but it gives you a level of insight and a level of detail that I think it's safe to say, it has not existed prior, in this category. So that's part 2, where the big boys played, where, as I said, I'm going into some of these aspects of the story and putting more of a microscope on it at a level that, quite frankly, I didn't have the time or space to do in the first book. And the final part is called A Wrestling Odyssey. And this is where I really address some of the changes that have occurred in the wrestling business since 2001, since the days of WCW, a change in sort of the mainstream wrestling style and the way that wrestling is presented, the proliferation of something which is often called, the wrestling bubble, the fact that you used to have, I think, a much more defined separation between sort of, for lack of a better phrase, your hardcore wrestling fans and then what is sometimes called a more casual audience, and how, for a variety of technological and cultural and economic reasons, that distinction has become blurred over time. And, I think it's a very different sort of composition of fan that makes up the fan base today. And we go into some of the implications of that. And also, there's a chapter which is one of my favorites, exploring the continued appeal of WCW. And, is it just nostalgia? Is it just the fact that it's been so long that, like a lot of other things, there's a sort of rhythm to it where anything that was popular in the past will eventually enjoy a second life? Or are there some additional factors at play here which have really propelled the interest in WCW beyond what it typically would have been? So by adopting this kind of structure, it's given me the ability to explore some areas that would not have been suitable for the first book. So for example, as I mentioned, there are some interlude chapters within these 3 parts, and one of them goes into, a very interesting sort of sidebar, I think, to the larger WCW story, which is the fact that many of the principles involved with WCW ended up in this, apparent attempt to reignite the Monday Night Wars competition with TNA. So there's a whole 15,000 word section all about the history of the TNA and Spike television, and you'll hear for the first time from some key executives on the Spike TV side. And again, as part of exploring some of these other areas, there's some really great content on late 90s WWF and some of the things that were happening there. So, by adopting this kind of structure, it's given me a license to go into some other areas. And, already this book, I'm glad to say, has become the highest selling book we've ever had, my personal website. And I think people have been blown away by the level of detail and, the fact that a lot of information that was just touched upon in the first book has really been blown up to a much greater level. I did over 100 interviews again for this book. Those are new interviews, gained access to a whole new treasure trove of internal company documents. And I think really the kind of crown jewel, as far as I'm concerned, some people may pick on other aspects of the book, but the real crown jewel is the fact that, these sort of debates that have always gone on about WCW's profitability and ultimate viability as a company within that Turner Corporation. When you read those 2 chapters, 12 and 13, I think you'll gain a level of appreciation of what was going on that I think, again, it's safe to say no other retrospective of this sort of subject has approached before. So it's a book that I'm really proud of. Like I said, it was a long time coming. Don't expect a, retread of, okay, we're going to start the story pre-Nitro and take you all the way through to the bitter end. That's already been done in the first book. So this is taking aspects of that story and really blowing them up, really going into a huge amount of detail, bringing in some other voices, touching on some other sort of related topics, TNA, what was happening in the WWF at the time. And all in all, you get a 200,000 word, 700 page book almost, which was a deliberate decision to provide, you with something that you can go back and read over and over again. As we say in the introduction, the sequencing of the book is deliberate, even though the chapters are essentially standalone chapters, as I mentioned. But on a later reading, I hope this would be the kind of book that if you want to get into one of those profiles that I talked about in the first part, you can put your attention there. If you want to revisit, a chapter in isolation later on in the book, you can do the same as well. I'm sure you'll get a lot of enjoyment from it. And again, encourage you, if you've enjoyed my work in the past, to pick it up. Again, the name of the book is Beyond Nitro, Untold Stories from the WCW Era, by myself, Guy Evans. You can go to Guy Evans Books or Amazon to get it.